In the article, we talked about the principle of squash and stretch and how important it is to your animations. Even though it's a principle that is often seen as something used in cartoony animations, it's actually a principle you can see in everyday life. It helps make your animations feel more fluid, appealing, and alive. As you can see from some of the examples in the article, we had the simple head turn, and without squash and stretch, it really feels kind of boring. Adding that squash and stretch to it really makes it feel more alive and kind of just more fun. While it's happening over just a few frames, it's kind of something more felt rather than seen, and that's kind of how you want to keep squash and stretch in the back of your mind. If you're not working on a cartoony, crazy style animation, you don't need a lot of squash and stretch to get the same feeling across. So now we're going to learn how to apply the principle of squash and stretch to a very basic ball bounce animation. We're using the ball rig, which you can find the download link in the article. And if you actually want to learn how to rig this ball, check out the Rigging a Cartoony Ball tutorial on the Digital-Tutors blog. So let's go ahead and get started. So we need to create first our ball bounce animations. And I just want to run this over just another time. I know we went over this in the timing and spacing tutorial, but this is something that's really good to kind of get drilled into your mind, kind of how to get the timing working and get the spacing working. So let's select our main control here. And we want to translate this ball up in the Y axis. And if we want, we can just go into our front view. And right now our grid is kind of a little bit too big. And if we go to our display grid, and we can just try to reset these settings here. Make sure we're working at the same settings, hit apply, and there we go. So just by resetting the settings, if you find your rig is a little bit too dense, you can just reset the settings to the Maya default. All right, so that makes it a little bit easier to see our ball here, and we actually want to be in the side view. All right, press 6 on our keyboard to go to shading mode. So we have the ball kind of translated up. Right now it's about around 10. Let's just kind of bring that up to, say, around 11 should work. And now we want to lock a key down by pressing S on our keyboard. And we also have auto key on. And you can enable that by just going down here to the auto keyframe toggle. And you want to just make sure that's red so that any changes we do to the ball will update with a new keyframe. So now let's go to frame 9 and change this translate Y value to 0 and go to frame 17. So we're just going 8 frames ahead and typing in a value of 11. Now we're going to frame 25. Again, 8 frames ahead. Translate Y, value of 0. Again, we have the auto key on, so it's locking in a keyframe whenever we change this value. So finally, we want to go to frame 33 and change the translate Y to 11 again. So that'll just bring the ball up there. So now if we play back this animation, you can see our ball is bouncing up and down. So if you remember in the timing and spacing article, we need to adjust our spacing to get this to behave and act like a real bouncing ball. So let's go up here to Window, Animation Editors, and let's just open up the graph editor there. All right, so we want to select our Translate Y, and let's just marquee select all of our curves here. And we're going to go to Free Tangent Weight. And that's just going to allow us to shrink and stretch our tangent handles here. So if we go to this one right here, we can just pull that one out by holding down Shift, left-clicking, and just dragging that out so we have a nice arc going through there. Again, we'll do this on this tangent handle. And finally, the last one here. Just pulling that out. And then we want to go to these bottom keyframes here where the ball actually hits the ground. And we're going to just bring that all the way in to where they're basically not even visible. So now we're kind of already seeing the bouncing motion we're going to get when we play back the animation in our viewport here. All right, great. So our ball is looking good, and we have the timing and spacing correct, so it's behaving how it should, but we can add some squash and stretch in there to really just kind of be that icing on the cake and really take this to the next step and add some more fluidity to it and just kind of make it feel more alive. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and just pause the animation here. And we can just go into our perspective, and I kind of want to just go over the controls real quick. We have these 4 different squash and stretch controls, and each one squashes it and stretches it in a different position. So if we just scroll this up you can see that it squashes from the bottom. If we select this top squash and stretch control, it's going to squash and stretch from the top. And the reason we have this is that if you wanted to start doing some rotation on your ball bounce here, you'll be able to squash it pretty much from any direction, so you don't need to worry about the rotation. Say if you only had one squash and stretch control on the bottom here, and your ball landed where it was rotated up to the top, this squash and stretch wouldn't really work because you can see that it's not going to squash and stretch properly. So just having these 4 squash and stretch controls will just help us out there. All right, great. So the first thing we want to do is select this top squash and stretch control and pop back into our side view here. And the first thing we want to do is select our top squash control here. And let's just press S on our keyboard to lock a keyframe in on frame 1. And we can go to, let's see here, frame 5 should work. And we're going to just lock another keyframe down by pressing S, because we don't want to have any stretching going on at that point in time. Now we're going to go frame 8, which is just before the contact, and now we're going to stretch this out to, say, around a value of 5. So now that we can see as the ball drops, it begins to stretch out. And now it's going to just keep in that same position. So what we need to do is go to frame 9, change this squash back to 0. Now you can see it squashes, or it stretches back to 0. And now we want to select this bottom control, and we want to lock a keyframe in on frame 8 by pressing S, go to frame 9, and now we want to squash the ball down to do a value of -5. You can see that we get this nice change happening there. We want to go to frame 10 and stretch the ball. Let's go to back to 5 again, which is the value we had before. And now we want to go to frame 14, which is a little bit ahead, and we're going to change this value back to 0. You can see as it travels back up, it kind of goes back to its default position. All right, now we want to select our top control again, and we want to lock a keyframe in on frame 21, and then we want to go to frame 24 just before the ball hits, stretch it out again, a value of 5. And the reason we locked a keyframe in at frame 21 is because we didn't want to have any change happening between frame 9 and 21. We want to keep it at a value of 0, and then from 21 to 24, that's when we want the ball to stretch out. And again, we can go to frame 25, change the squash to 0. Now select the bottom control and go to frame 24. I kind of just lock a keyframe in by pressing S, and then go to frame 25, and we can change this to -5 on the squash value there. And then go to 26, and we're going to just stretch that out again, typing in a value of 5. We want to keep this the same all across the board. And then now, let's go to frame 30, and just set this squash value back to 0. And now we should get some nice squash and stretch happening in our ball bounce here. All right, great. So adding that squash and stretch really adds more force to this. You can exaggerate this more, or you can kind of tone it down and make the squash and stretch less prominent, kind of whatever you want to do. And again, you can change this spacing of the actual ball by going into the animation editor, the graph editor, and kind of tweaking this. If you didn't want to have it to hit so hard, you can kind of select one of these tangent handles and kind of bring it out again, just to kind of make that hit a little bit softer. Something like that. Again, we'll do the same on this handle, selecting that tangent handle, and kind of just bringing it out there just a little bit. Make the impact a little bit softer because we have that stretch going on, so we're really getting a nice, strong impact there. So we've learned how to apply some squash and stretch to this basic ball bounce here. Now what I want you to do is take this a step further. In the previous articles, you learned about timing and spacing. So create a ball bounce, but instead of having it bounce in place like this, have it actually moving across the screen from left to right, and try to incorporate some rotation in there, as well as squash and stretch to really help drive these principles home. So in the next article, we're going to learn about the principle of anticipation. So be sure to check back to the Digital Tutors blog for more free tutorials.